When Hauptmann Ernst Vogel's Panther crew first spotted the American tank destroyers racing at full speed across the open Belgian fields in December 1944, they laughed at what seemed like a suicide charge. 3 minutes later, as armor-piercing shells tore through their tank's vulnerable side plates from an impossible angle, Vogel realized these Americans weren't charging, they were hunting, and the hunters had just become the prey. The morning of December 18th, 1944, broke cold and bitter over the forests near Malmedy, Belgium. Hauptmann Ernst Vogel stood in the commander's cupola of his Panther OSF G, scanning the tree line with Zeiss binoculars that had served him since North Africa. At 32 years old, Vogel was considered a veteran, a survivor of Kursk, a witness to the systematic destruction of German armor superiority on the Eastern Front. Now, transferred to the West for what High Command called rest and refit, he found himself commanding the 3rd Platoon of Panzer Regiment 39, part of the 116th Panzer Division. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Panther beneath him represented the pinnacle of German tank design, 75mm KWK 42 litres, 70 gun, 80mm of sloped frontal armor, capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. On paper, it was invincible. Vogel had learned long ago that paper burned easily. Beside him in the turret, Unteroffizier Hans Müller adjusted the gun sight for the 3rd time that morning. Müller was 24, a Berliner with steady hands and sharper eyes. He'd been Vogel's gunner for 8 months, long enough to develop the wordless communication that kept crews alive. In the driver's compartment below, Gefreiter Otto Richter sat with his hands on the controls, a farm boy from Bavaria who could coax the Maybach engine through conditions that would have stopped lesser drivers. The radio operator, Schütze Werner Klein, monitored frequencies with the intensity of a man who understood that information killed as surely as shells. Their loader, Grenadier Paul Schmidt, was the youngest at 19, a replacement who'd arrived just 2 weeks earlier, still carrying the rigid posture of training that combat would beat out of him if he survived long enough. Movement, Müller said quietly, his eye pressed to the sight. Southwest, near the ridge line. 2. No, 3 vehicles. Vogel swung his binoculars. The American M10 tank destroyers emerged from the morning mist like grey ghosts, their open-topped turrets distinctive even at 1,500 meters. They moved in a loose formation, not the tight parade ground arrangement Americans usually favored. M10s, Vogel confirmed. Tank destroyers, 3-inch guns. Easy kills, Müller muttered, already calculating range and lead. On the steppes, outside Prokhorovka, in the bocage country of Normandy, from crews who were now buried in soil from Smolensk to Caen, easy kills had a way of becoming hard deaths. The Americans appeared to be conducting a reconnaissance sweep, their movements cautious but not timid. Vogel's tactical mind processed the geometry. His 3 Panthers held perfect hull-down positions along the forest edge, frontal armor angled toward any approach. The M10s would have to cross 800 meters of open ground to reach effective range. Even if their 3-inch guns could penetrate a Panther doubtful at anything beyond point-blank range, they'd never get the chance. Range to target? Vogel asked. 1,400 meters and closing, Müller replied. 12 degrees left. Hold fire, Vogel ordered. Let them commit. This was the calculus of December 1944. Every shell mattered. Every gallon of fuel was irreplaceable. Every engagement had to be decisive. The Great Ardennes, offensive Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies, was already faltering. Vogel had seen the fuel trucks burning on the roads, watched the promised air support fail to materialize, counted the gaps in formations that should have been solid with armor. They were an army running on fumes and faith, neither of which stopped American shells. The M10s continued their advance, angling slightly northeast. Standard American doctrine: advance to contact, develop the situation, call for support. Predictable. Safe. The kind of tactics wealthy nations with unlimited resources could afford. They're turning, Klein reported from his radio station. changing heading, now moving parallel to us. Vogel frowned. The M10s had altered course before entering his kill zone, now tracking laterally across his front at approximately 1,200 meters. Not retreating, not advancing, repositioning. They've spotted us, Mueller said. Impossible, Vogel replied. We're in full shadow, hull down. They'd need… The sharp crack of a 3-inch gun interrupted him. The shell screamed past, missing by 50 meters but close enough to shower their position with frozen earth. The M10s were accelerating now, their engines audible even at distance, a rising growl that spoke of power being unleashed. "Return fire," Vogel ordered. "Target left vehicle." Mueller's response was immediate. The Panther's 75mm gun spoke with authority, the recoil rocking the 45-ton vehicle. Through his binoculars, Vogel watched the tracer arc toward the lead M10. The shot was perfect. Mueller never missed at this range. The M10 wasn't there. In the seconds between trigger pull and impact, the American vehicle had accelerated hard right, the shell passing through empty air where it should have been. The M10's engine roared as it hit what Vogel estimated was 30 miles per hour, impossible speed for a 30-ton vehicle on rough ground. "How did?" Mueller began. "Second target," Vogel snapped. "Fire!" The second Panther in his platoon, commanded by Lieutenant Friedrich Weber, fired simultaneously. 2 perfect shots at 1,100 meters, both missing as the M10s broke formation and scattered like startled rabbits. But rabbits didn't move with purpose, didn't maintain tactical spacing while executing evasive maneuvers at speeds that violated every assumption about American armor. "They're flanking," Klein said, his voice tight. 2 breaking left, 1 right. The M10s were using their speed, ridiculous, impossible speed, to split his position's attention. The 2 vehicles moving left were drawing fire from Weber's Panther, while the single M10 on the right was… "Traverse right!" Vogel shouted. "Fast traverse, now!" Mueller spun the turret hand crank frantically, but the Panther's electric traverse was painfully slow compared to the mechanical speed of the approaching threat. The lone M10 had covered 300 meters in the time it took their turret to swing 40 degrees, its 3-inch gun already tracking toward them. The American fired first. The shell struck their Panther's frontal armor with a sound like God's hammer on an anvil. 80 millimeters of hardened steel did its job. The shell ricocheted upward, leaving a fist-sized crater but no penetration. Inside the turret, the impact rang like being trapped inside a bell. Schmidt, the young loader, cried out in shock, hands pressed to his ears. "Load armor-piercing," Vogel ordered, fighting to control his voice. "Mueller, fire as you bear." But the M10 was already moving again, accelerating past them at an angle that made Mueller's careful aim useless. Vogel watched in disbelief as the American vehicle crossed their front at what had to be 35 miles per hour, tracks throwing frozen mud, engines screaming. The Panthers could barely manage 15 on good roads, 25 if the Maybach was fresh, and the ground flat. This was neither. "He's going for our flank," Richter called from the driver's seat, his voice edged with the first notes of panic. Vogel understood instantly. The Panther's frontal armor was impenetrable to the M10's 3-inch gun, but the side armor 40 millimeters, vertical, designed to stop machine gun fire and shell fragments, would crack open like an egg under American armor-piercing rounds. "Driver, hard right. Follow him around." The Panther lurched into motion, Richter gunning the Maybach engine. But turning a 45-ton tank was like trying to dance with a building. The M10, 30 tons with a purpose-built high-speed drivetrain, curved around their position with the agility of a hunting cat. Through the vision blocks, Vogel caught glimpses of the American tank destroyer turret, swiveling smoothly, commander's head visible in the open top. No panic, no rush. Professional, practiced. This crew had done this before. "I can't get a shot," Mueller shouted, cranking the traverse frantically. "He's too fast." The second American shell hit their left side at a 90-degree angle. 40 millimeters of vertical armor lasted exactly as long as physics predicted against a 3-inch armor-piercing shell at point-blank range. The penetrator punched through the steel plate, vaporized into molten fragments, and filled the crew compartment with supersonic death. Richter died first. the shell entering directly behind his seat. Klein was killed by secondary fragmentation, a piece of the tank's own armor taking off the top of his skull. The blast wave threw Schmidt against the turret wall hard enough to crack ribs. Vogel felt something hot and wet spray across his face, Klein's blood, and then the smoke and fire took over. "Out!" Vogel screamed, already grabbing Schmidt by his collar. "Everybody out!" Müller was moving on instinct, shoving the wounded Schmidt toward the turret hatch. Vogel hauled himself up and out, fell rather than climbed, from the commander's cupola, hit the frozen ground hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. Behind him, Müller dragged Schmidt clear, as flames began licking from the driver's compartment. They ran, 20 meters, 50. Behind them, the Panther's ammunition cooked off with a muffled whump that sent the turret lifting slightly before settling back down. Vogel collapsed behind a fallen log, Müller and Schmidt piling in beside him. The young loader was crying, hands pressed to his ribs, blood on his lips. "Richter?" Müller gasped. Vogel shook his head. Klein and Richter were still in there, or what remained of them. Across the field, Lieutenant Weber's Panther was fighting desperately against the two M10s that had flanked left. Vogel watched as Weber's gunner scored a direct hit on one M10's turret. Finally a kill. The American vehicle slewed to a stop, smoke pouring from the open top. But the second M10 was already in position, firing into Weber's side armor from 800 meters. The Panther brewed up instantly, flames erupting from every hatch. "Sir," Müller whispered, pointing. The M10 that had killed them killed their tank. Vogel corrected himself numbly, had stopped 400 meters away. The commander stood in the open turret, binoculars raised, scanning the battlefield, assessing, planning the next kill. Vogel found himself studying the American vehicle with the detached clarity of shock. It was ugly compared to the Panther's predatory lines, a squat, angular box on tracks with an open-topped turret that looked vulnerable to everything from artillery to rain. But it was fast. God in heaven, it was fast. The third Panther in his platoon, commanded by Feldwebel Gustav Hauptmann, was pulling back now, tracks churning as it reversed into deeper forest cover. Smart, Hauptmann was a survivor, had been since Stalingrad. He understood when to fight and when to preserve the tank for another day. The surviving M10s didn't pursue. They held position, turrets tracking, engines idling, not celebrating their victory, not congratulating themselves on kills, just watching, ready, professional. After 2 minutes, they began withdrawing, moving at that same impossible speed, covering each other in alternating bounds that spoke of doctrine and discipline. Vogel watched them disappear into the mist. Behind him, his Panther burned, sending a column of black smoke into the grey December sky. He could smell burning rubber, cooking metal, and underneath it all, the sweet, sick odour of burning flesh. "What just happened?" Schmidt whispered, his voice small and lost. Vogel didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about the tactical briefings, the intelligence reports that described American tanks as slow, clumsy, over-engineered machines crewed by soldiers who preferred overwhelming firepower to tactical finesse. He was thinking about his own assumptions, built from 2 years of fighting Soviets, whose tactics favored mass over maneuver, whose T-34 seconds won through numbers rather than innovation. The Americans had just killed 2 Panthers and crippled a 3rd platoon without losing a single vehicle to German fire. They'd done it with speed, coordination, and a tactical sophistication that violated everything Vogel thought he knew about the Western Allies. "They hunted us," Vogel finally said, speaking more to himself than his surviving crew. "We had superior armor, superior firepower, superior positions, and they hunted us like we were prey." Müller was staring at their burning tank, his face expressionless. "The 3-inch gun can't penetrate our frontal armor." "It doesn't matter," Vogel replied quietly. "They don't fight from the front. By nightfall, what remained of Panzer Regiment 39's 2nd Company had assembled in a frozen field 3 kilometers behind the morning's disaster. 6 Panthers out of 14 had survived the day's fighting. 3 more had thrown tracks during the retreat and been abandoned when the recovery vehicles couldn't reach them. too, had simply run out of fuel, left behind like dying animals. Vogel sat on the rear deck of Hauptmann's Panther, watching medics load wounded men into an ambulance that had already made 3 trips. Schmidt was among them, his ribs wrapped, his eyes distant with shock. Müller stood nearby, methodically cleaning his sidearm for the 3rd time, the repetitive action keeping his hands busy and his mind from dwelling on Klein and Richter. Major Otto Kessler, the battalion commander, emerged from his command vehicle, a ST KFZ, 250 half-track, that looked small and fragile compared to the Panthers surrounding it. Kessler was 45, a professional soldier from the old army, and the deep lines around his eyes spoke of too many retreats, too many eulogies. "Hauptmann Vogel," Kessler said quietly. "Walk with me." They moved away from the assembled tanks, boots crunching on frozen grass. In the distance, artillery rumbled. American guns, always American guns, constant as a heartbeat. "Tell me what happened," Kessler said. Vogel gave his report with the mechanical precision of a man reciting facts to keep emotions at bay. The M10s appearance, their speed, the flanking maneuver that had turned a perfect ambush position into a killing ground for German armor. Kessler listened without interrupting. When Vogel finished, the major was quiet for a long moment, staring toward the western horizon, where American forces continued their advance. "This is the 3rd such report I've received today," Kessler finally said. 4th Panzer Army Headquarters has 7 more. The Americans are using these M10s as cavalry fast-moving hunter-killer teams that refuse to fight frontally. "Our intelligence said they were defensive weapons," Vogel said, "towed guns on tank chassis for ambush positions." "Our intelligence," Kessler replied with bitter humor, "hasn't been correct about much since 1942. The Americans have adapted their doctrine. Or perhaps they always intended to use them this way and we simply weren't paying attention." "The speed is the problem," Vogel said. "Our Panthers can kill them easily if we can hit them, but at 35 miles per hour, crossing rough ground, they can pick their engagement range and angle. They dictate the terms of every fight." Kessler nodded slowly. "I've sent a report to division. They're sending a technical team to examine the M10 you disabled this morning, the one Lieutenant Weber's gunner destroyed. They want to understand how these vehicles achieve such performance." "Will it matter?" Vogel asked. "Even if we understand how they do it, we can't replicate it. The Panther's drivetrain can't be modified to—" "No," Kessler interrupted. "We can't make our tanks faster. But perhaps we can develop tactics to counter their speed advantage, deeper defensive positions, interlocking fields of fire, infantry support to deny them the flanking routes they prefer." Both men knew these were desperate measures. The Americans had fuel for their fast maneuvers. They had air support to protect their flanks. They had artillery to suppress German positions before their armor moved in. Most critically, they had the initiative they chose when and where to fight, could break contact when conditions weren't favorable, could afford to trade time for advantage. "How many Panthers does the regiment have operational?" Vogel asked. 42 as of this morning. Probably 35 by now, given your reports and others." Kessler's voice was flat. "We started the Ardennes offensive with 83. This is day 3. The arithmetic was brutal. At this rate of attrition, the regiment would cease to exist as a fighting force within a week, and this was supposed to be the great counterstroke, the offensive that would split the Allied armies and turn the tide in the West." "The fuel situation?" Vogel ventured. "Critical. We're rationing down to emergency reserves. If we don't capture American fuel depots within the next 48 hours, most of our armor will be immobilized regardless of damage." They walked in silence for a minute, 2 soldiers who understood that the war was lost, but couldn't say the words aloud. Around them, tank crews worked on their vehicles by lamplight, checking tracks, loading ammunition, performing the endless maintenance that kept complex machines functional. They worked with the focused intensity of men who knew their survival depended on their tools. "The crew you lost," Kessler said quietly. "Klein and Richter, both good men." "Yes, sir. I'll write to their families personally. Not that it helps." "No, sir, it doesn't." Kessler stopped walking, turned to face Vogel directly. I need your platoon operational by dawn. We're shifting south to block the American advance toward Bastogne. Intelligence indicates heavy armor moving on that axis. More M10s? Undoubtedly, along with Shermans, infantry, artillery, everything the Americans can bring to bear. Kessler's expression was grim. I won't lie to you. Ernst, the tactical situation is deteriorating, but we have our orders, and we have our duty. Vogel understood what wasn't being said. They would fight until they were destroyed because there was no alternative. Retreat meant court-martial or summary execution by SS field police. Surrender meant dishonor and possibly death for their families back in Germany. So they would fight, and most would die, and the war would grind forward toward its inevitable conclusion. We'll be ready, sir, Vogel said. Kessler nodded, started to turn away, then paused. That American commander, the one whose M10 destroyed your Panther, did you observe anything about his tactics? Anything we might learn? Vogel thought about those final moments. The M10's curved approach, the perfect angle of attack, the commander's calm assessment from his open turret, even after scoring a kill. He was patient, Vogel said slowly. He had speed, but he didn't rely on speed alone. He waited for the perfect shot, the perfect angle. He fought like a hunter, not a cavalryman. The Americans are learning, Kessler observed. They started this war with inferior tanks and poor doctrine. Now they're killing our best armor with 30-ton improvised vehicles. That should terrify us more than their numbers or their industry. Yes, sir. After Kessler departed, Vogel returned to find Müller still cleaning his pistol. The gunner looked up, his face haggard in the lamplight. That if I'd just been quicker on the trigger, maybe— You did everything right, Vogel interrupted. We all did. The problem wasn't our crew work or our gunnery. The problem was that they fought a different kind of battle than we were prepared for. Will it happen again tomorrow? Vogel thought about lying, about offering false comfort, but Müller deserved better than comfortable lies. Yes, Vogel said. Tomorrow and every day after, until this offensive burns out, or we do. The Americans have found a tactic that works against our armor. They'll keep using it until we find a counter, or until there are no more Panthers to kill. Müller resumed cleaning his pistol, the action now almost meditative. I want revenge, he said quietly. For Klein, for Richter, I want to kill every one of those bastards. So do I, Vogel admitted, but wanting revenge and getting it are very different things. Right now, I'd settle for surviving another day. Around them, the sounds of preparation continued, engines turning over, tracks being adjusted, ammunition being loaded, the machinery of war, inexorable and indifferent. Somewhere in the darkness, American forces were making their own preparations, their own plans, and among them, crews of fast, ugly, devastatingly effective tank destroyers were probably receiving orders for tomorrow's hunt. Vogel climbed onto Hauptmann's Panther and stretched out on the engine deck, letting the residual heat from the Maybach warm his frozen body. Above him, stars appeared between gaps in the clouds, distant, cold, and uncaring. He closed his eyes and tried not to think about Klein's blood on his face, Richter's final moment of terror, or the sound of that 3-inch shell punching through 40 millimeters of steel plate like it was paper. Sleep wouldn't come. It rarely did anymore. Instead, he lay awake and listened to the sounds of an army that was learning too late, too slowly, that technological superiority meant nothing without the fuel to move, the air cover to protect, and the tactical flexibility to adapt. The Americans had all three. The Wehrmacht had none. And tomorrow, the hunt would begin again. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. December 19th, 1944, began with freezing rain that turned the Belgian landscape into a grey blur of misery. Oberst Heinrich Brandt arrived at the forward collection point at 0730 hours, stepping from his Kübelwagen into ankle-deep mud that immediately soaked through his boots. Brandt was part of Waffenprüfamt 6, the Wehrmacht's technical testing department, and at 51 years old, he represented a dying breed. Engineers who understood that wars were won through understanding your enemy's capabilities as much as your own strengths. The disabled M10 tank destroyer sat in what had once been a farmer's field, now churned into moonscape by retreating German forces. The vehicle had taken a direct hit to its turret from Lieutenant Weber's Panther, the 75mm shell punching through the open-topped fighting compartment and killing the entire American crew instantly. The M10 had coasted another 30 meters before the driver, already dead at his controls, had slumped forward, cutting the engine. Brandt approached the vehicle slowly, notebook already in hand. Accompanying him was Hauptfeldwebel Victor Steiner, a mechanical specialist who'd spent 15 years maintaining German armor before the war had turned him into a mobile diagnostic unit. Steiner carried a toolkit that weighed nearly 20 kilograms, precision instruments wrapped in oilcloth, the treasured possessions of a craftsman who understood that knowledge began with measurement. The Americans abandoned it, Brandt asked, studying the vehicle's exterior. Retreated under artillery fire, replied the infantry lieutenant who'd been guarding the wreck. They tried to recover it with another M10, but we had an 88 positioned on the ridge. Put 3 rounds close enough to convince them it wasn't worth the risk. Brandt circled the M10, making notes. The vehicle was smaller than he'd expected, perhaps 5.5 meters long, 2.5 wide. The tracks were relatively narrow compared to German designs, the suspension surprisingly simple. The armor was clearly thin, welded rather than cast in most places. At first glance, it looked like exactly what German intelligence had described. A makeshift vehicle, a towed anti-tank gun mounted on a tank chassis as an expedient measure. But expediency didn't explain what Hauptmann Vogel had reported. It didn't explain 35 miles per hour on rough ground, or the tactical sophistication that had destroyed 2 Panthers in minutes. Let's start with the power plant, Brandt said, moving to the rear of the vehicle. Steiner was already there, toolkit open, removing the engine access panels with practiced efficiency. What they revealed made both men pause. The engine was enormous, far larger than what the vehicle's size suggested it should contain. Brandt knelt in the mud, peering into the compartment, making rapid notes. Twin General Motors, diesel engines, Steiner said, running his hands over the machinery with the reverence of a man appreciating fine craftsmanship. 6-cylinder each, connected to a common cylinder drive shaft through. He paused, leaning deeper into the compartment. Through what appears to be an automated transmission system. Brandt frowned. Diesels? The Americans use diesels? In their tank destroyers, apparently. Steiner was pulling out measuring tools now, a micrometer and bore gauge. The displacement on these is, Herr Oberst, each engine appears to be over 6 liters. Combined output would be, he calculated quickly, somewhere between 375 and 400 horsepower. Brandt wrote the numbers down, but his engineer's mind was already racing ahead. The Panther's Maybach HL 230 produced 690 horsepower, substantially more than this American design. But the Panther weighed 45 tons. This M10 couldn't be more than 30. Power-to-weight ratio, Brandt muttered. Exactly, Steiner agreed. The Panther has roughly 15 horsepower per ton. This vehicle, he consulted his notes. If we estimate 29 tons combat weight, this has approximately 13 horsepower per ton. Close, but not enough to explain the speed advantage Hauptmann Vogel described. Then the answer is elsewhere, Brandt said. The transmission, the final drives. Show me. They spent the next hour disassembling the M10's drivetrain, working methodically despite the cold and the distant sound of artillery. What they discovered was a masterclass in automotive engineering applied to military problems. The transmission was a torque-matic unit, an automatic system that eliminated the need for manual gear changes. Steiner explained it as he traced the mechanical linkages. The driver essentially has 2 controls, accelerator and brake. The transmission selects optimal gearing automatically based on load and speed. No clutch, no shifting, just pure, continuous power delivery. Brandt understood the implications immediately. German tanks required skilled drivers who could double-clutch through 8 gears, timing each shift to maintain momentum. It was complicated, demanding, prone to errors under stress. The Americans had eliminated the entire problem by automating the process. The final drives, Steiner continued, moving to examine the track assemblies. Use spiral bevel gears rather than our straight-cut design, lower friction, smoother power transfer. And the track itself, he lifted a section of the tread, is rubber-bushed, reduces metal-on-metal contact, decreases rolling resistance. Every component they examined revealed the same philosophy. The Americans had prioritized reliability and ease of operation over raw power, where German engineers sought perfection through precision, tight tolerances, complex mechanisms, superior materials. The Americans had achieved effectiveness through simplicity. The suspension is fascinating, Steiner said, crawling beneath the vehicle despite the mud. Vertical volute springs. Ancient design. Really, you see it on tractors, agricultural equipment, but look at the travel distance, the dampening characteristics. This vehicle can absorb terrain roughness that would shake a Panther apart at high speed. Brandt was beginning to understand. The M10 wasn't faster than a Panther because it had a more powerful engine. It was faster because every system had been optimized for sustained high-speed operation over rough terrain. The Panther was a thoroughbred racehorse, incredible performance under ideal conditions. The M10 was a wolf built to run for hours across any terrain, sacrificing nothing to elegance or pride. The fuel system, Brandt said. Check the fuel system. Steiner moved to the fuel tanks, measuring, calculating. Capacity appears to be approximately 600 litres, but they're using diesel fuel, which is denser than our gasoline. Energy content per litre is higher, and diesel engines are more thermally efficient. They extract more work from each litre of fuel consumed. The arithmetic was damning. The M10 could operate for roughly 200 kilometres on internal fuel, less than a Panther's 250 kilometres, but not drastically less. Except the Panther's range assumed ideal conditions and careful driving. In combat, with frequent acceleration and high-speed maneuvering, the Maybach's fuel consumption skyrocketed. The diesel engines in the M10 maintained consistent efficiency regardless of throttle position. They can afford to use their speed, Brandt said quietly. Our tanks must conserve fuel constantly. Every high-speed maneuver burns reserves we can't replace. But these Americans can run at full throttle all day and still have fuel to spare. Steiner nodded grimly. It's not just the mechanical design, it's the entire logistical philosophy. They built a vehicle that assumes abundant fuel. Because they have abundant fuel, we built vehicles that assumed careful resource management, because that's all we've ever known. They moved to examine the turret next, despite the grim evidence of the shell that had killed the crew. The 3-inch M7 gun was simpler than German designs, a straightforward adaptation of an anti-aircraft weapon, with fewer moving parts and easier maintenance than the KWK-42. The traverse mechanism was manual but well designed, with large handwheels that allowed rapid slewing. No power traverse, Steiner observed, but at 30 tons instead of 45, the turret is lighter. Manual traverse is actually faster than our electric motors. The turret basket was spacious, the crew positions well laid out. Ammunition storage was accessible and logical. Everything spoke of a design that prioritized operational efficiency over theoretical superiority. Brandt spent another hour examining smaller details, the vision blocks, the communication equipment, the commander's position. The radio was particularly interesting, a compact American design that occupied a fraction of the space of German equivalents while providing similar range and reliability. By noon, they had compiled a comprehensive analysis. Brandt sat in his Kübelwagen, writing his report while Steiner photographed the M10 from every angle. The conclusions were inescapable. The M10 tank destroyer represented a fundamentally different approach to armored warfare, where German designs prioritized gunpowder and armor protection, the ability to win direct engagements through superior firepower. The American design prioritized mobility and operational endurance. The M10 wasn't meant to slug it out with Panthers in frontal duels. It was meant to avoid those duels entirely, using speed and maneuverability to dictate engagement terms. The open-topped turret bothers me, Steiner admitted, joining Brandt in the vehicle. No overhead protection. Vulnerable to artillery, to air attack, even to small arms fire from elevated positions. It's a calculated trade-off, Brandt replied. The open turret reduces weight by several tons, which improves the power-to-weight ratio. It also improves crew awareness. The commander has unobstructed vision in all directions, and it eliminates the need for a complex turret ventilation system, which means one less mechanical system to fail. But it risks the crew. Yes, but the Americans appear to believe that avoiding being hit is more valuable than protecting against hits you can't avoid. Brandt closed his notebook. It's the philosophy of an attacker, not a defender. They're willing to accept vulnerability because they plan to maintain the initiative, to keep moving, to never be where the enemy expects. Steiner was quiet for a moment. Can we counter it? This speed, this mobility? Brandt considered the question carefully. Tactically, perhaps. Deeper defensive positions, as Major Kessler suggested to Hauptmann Vogel. Better coordination between tanks and infantry to deny flanking routes. More aggressive use of terrain to limit mobility corridors. But fundamentally? He shook his head. Fundamentally, we're fighting World War I tactics with World War II technology. The Americans are fighting World War II tactics with vehicles designed specifically for that kind of warfare. So, we're obsolete. No. The Panther is still a formidable weapon. In a straight fight, at range, it will destroy an M10 every time. But that's the problem. The Americans refuse to fight straight. They've learned that mobility is a weapon as powerful as gun caliber or armor thickness. They've built an entire tactical doctrine around that principle, and we're only now beginning to understand what they're doing. Brandt's report would reach Wehrmacht High Command 3 days later. It would be read, filed, and ultimately ignored, not because the analysis was wrong, but because the conclusions were operationally useless. Germany lacked the fuel to train crews in high-speed maneuver warfare. It lacked the industrial capacity to retool production for lighter, faster vehicles. Most critically, it lacked the strategic initiative that made mobility valuable in the first place. The Americans could afford to build fast, lightly armored vehicles because they were attacking, because they controlled the air, because their logistics could support deep penetrations. The Germans needed heavy armor because they were defending, because enemy artillery could reach any position, because retreat meant abandoning irreplaceable equipment to fuel shortages. But understanding why you're losing doesn't stop the losing. December 21st found Vogel's reconstituted platoon in defensive positions south of Bastogne, occupying a tree line that overlooked a road junction American forces would need to relieve the encircled town. His command now consisted of just 2 Panthers, his own replacement vehicle, and Feldwebel Hoffmann's veteran tank. A third Panther had been promised but never arrived, lost to mechanical failure or fuel shortage, or simply the chaos of a collapsing offensive. Müller was back in the gunner's seat, silent and focused. A replacement driver named Corporal Ludwig sat where Richter had died, a taciturn Prussian who spoke only when necessary. The new radio operator, Private First Class Joseph, was barely 18, drafted from a Luftwaffe ground crew when the Reich ran out of pilots before it ran out of planes. Their loader was another replacement, whose name Vogel hadn't bothered to learn, yet the turnover was too high, the attachment too painful. Movement on the highway, Müller reported. American convoy, trucks, half-tracks, and M10s, 4 of them, advancing as screen. The American column was moving cautiously. The M10s spread wide in a defensive formation that covered all approaches. Behind them, trucks carried infantry, supplies, ammunition, everything needed to break through to Bastogne. This was exactly the kind of target German armor existed to destroy. Range? Vogel asked. 1,800 meters to lead vehicle. They're moving at, I estimate 20 kilometers per hour. Hold fire. Let them close to 1,200 meters, then engage the M10s first, disable their mobility, trap the convoy. It was sound tactics, exactly what doctrine prescribed. But Vogel felt a gnawing doubt in his gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive through 2 years of Eastern Front combat. Something about the American formation bothered him. The M10s were too spread out. They weren't screening the convoy so much as hunting. "Sir," Joseph said from the radio station. "I'm picking up American radio traffic. Encoded, but high volume. They're coordinating something." "Position estimate?" Vogel demanded. "Multiple sources. Some from the M10s, but also from, I don't know, somewhere behind them. The signal strength suggests the first shells arrived without warning. 3 rounds of American 105mm artillery that bracketed Hauptmann's Panther with such precision they had to be directed by a forward observer. Hauptmann's tank buttoned up immediately, but the infantry supporting their position scattered, seeking cover in the frozen earth. "They know we're here," Müller said unnecessarily. Vogel was already processing the tactical situation. The M10s hadn't spotted them at 1,800 meters, hull down in tree-line shadow. They should be invisible, but the Americans knew this position was occupied. They'd plotted it, called artillery, and were now the M10s split formation. 2 accelerated hard right, angling away from the road. The other 2 broke left, engines roaring as they hit what Vogel now recognized as their combat speed, that impossible 35 miles per hour that turned defensive positions into death traps. "They're flanking before we even fire," Vogel said, understanding flooding through him. "They're not reacting to contact, they're proactively denying us the engagement we want." "Orders?" Müller asked. His eye pressed to the sight, tracking the right-hand M10s. Vogel made his decision. "Fire on the left group. Hauptmann, engage right. We need to score kills before they get angular advantage." Both Panthers fired simultaneously. Müller's shot was perfect, a textbook hit on a moving target at 1,400 meters. The shell struck the lead M10 squarely in the hull, and ricocheted. "Impossible," Müller breathed. "That's impossible. We hit center mass." But Vogel had seen the angle the M10 had been traversing, rough ground at the instant of impact, its hull tilted perhaps 15 degrees. The shell had struck sloped armor instead of vertical plate, and that difference had meant survival instead of destruction. The M10s continued their flanking maneuvers, now supported by smoke rounds that began landing between the German positions and the American vehicles. Within seconds, visibility dropped to less than 100 meters. Vogel ordered, "Back 50 meters, then traverse right. They're going to try the same maneuver as before." Panther into reverse, backing deeper into the tree line. But Hauptmann's crew wasn't as quick to react. Through gaps in the smoke, Vogel caught glimpses of Hauptmann's Panther, still in its original position, turret traversing frantically as the crew tried to acquire targets in the artificial fog. The American 3-inch gun spoke twice in rapid succession. The first shell missed Hauptmann's tank by meters. The second, fired 3 seconds later, after the M10 had adjusted for Hauptmann's evasive turn, struck perfectly in the side armor. Hauptmann's Panther died exactly as Vogel's first tank had died 2 days earlier. The penetration, the internal explosion, the cooking off of ammunition. Vogel watched 3 crew members bail out, 2 of them on fire. Hauptmann wasn't among them. "Target acquired!" Müller shouted. 1,000 meters, moving left to right. Fire!" The 75mm gun bucked. Through his optics, Vogel saw the M10 stagger as the shell hit its track assembly, throwing the track entirely off the drive wheels. The American vehicle slewed to a stop, immobilized but not destroyed. "Good hit," Vogel confirmed. "Traverse left, find the second." The shell that struck them came from behind an angle that should have been impossible, except it wasn't impossible because there had been 4 M10s, and Vogel had only been tracking 3. The fourth had circled wide, moving at that relentless high speed, and had positioned itself for a flank shot from 800 meters. 40mm of side armor failed its test for the second time in 3 days. The difference was that Vogel was ready this time. Even as the penetrator entered the crew compartment, he was moving, grabbing his replacement loader and throwing both of them toward the turret hatch. Müller was right behind them, moving with the desperate speed of a man who'd survived one brewing tank and refused to die in another. They hit the ground running, smoke and flames already billowing from their Panther. Behind them, Ludwig never made it out. The shell had entered directly through the driver's compartment, and whatever remained of the Prussian corporal stayed with his tank. Vogel and his surviving crew ran through the forest, American shells chasing them as the M10s systematically destroyed the now abandoned German position. Behind them, both Panthers burned, adding their smoke to the winter sky. They ran for nearly a kilometre before collapsing in a drainage ditch, gasping for air, soaked with mud and sweat despite the freezing temperature. Müller was crying silently, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face. The young loader Vogel still hadn't learned his name, was praying in whispered Latin. For the second time in 3 days, Vogel had lost his tank, lost crew members, lost a tactical engagement to an enemy he'd been taught to dismiss as inferior. The Americans with their crude designs and overwhelming numbers. Except the designs weren't crude, they were optimized, and the numbers didn't overwhelm, they executed. Through the trees, Vogel could hear the American convoy resuming its advance, the M10s once again in screening positions, engines growling like the predators they'd proven themselves to be. They would reach Bastogne, they would break the siege, and there was nothing left in the German playbook to stop them. Müller finally spoke, his voice raw. "We're going to lose, aren't we? The war. Everything." Vogel wanted to offer denial, to cite propaganda about wonder weapons and strategic withdrawals and the inevitable triumph of German will, but he was tired of lies, tired of watching good men die for promises that had long since turned to ash. "Yes," Vogel said quietly, "we're going to lose. We've already lost. We just haven't finished dying yet." The young loader stopped praying. Müller wiped his face. Around them, the sounds of battle continued, the distant thunder of artillery, the chatter of machine guns, the rumble of engines, that no longer belonged to German tanks. They would make their way back to German lines. They would be assigned to another unit, another Panther, another doomed defensive position. They would fight because that was all they knew how to do, because surrender meant consequences they couldn't face, because the machine of war ground forward, regardless of hope or despair. But something had broken in that Belgian forest, some last illusion of tactical superiority, some final belief that superior engineering and iron discipline could overcome material reality. The Americans had built a weapon system specifically designed to hunt German armor, had trained crews in the doctrine to use it effectively, and had deployed it with the fuel and support to make that doctrine devastating. Speed had proven more valuable than armor, maneuverability had trumped firepower, and the hunters, with their ugly, fast, 30-ton improvised weapons, had taught the predators what it meant to be prey. In the distance, another Panther's ammunition cooked off, the characteristic double explosion marking another kill, another crew dead or scattered, another magnificent machine reduced to burning wreckage. The sound had become so common, it barely registered anymore, just the background noise of a war entering its final, brutal arithmetic. Vogel closed his eyes and thought about the M10 commander he'd watched through his binoculars 3 days ago, standing calmly in his open turret, assessing the battlefield after scoring a kill. Professional, confident, victorious. That was what defeat looked like from the other side. The technical report filed by Oberst Brandt reached Supreme Headquarters on December 27, 1944. It was 37 pages of detailed analysis, accompanied by photographs, mechanical drawings, and strategic assessments. The conclusions were clear and damning. The American M10 tank destroyer represented a paradigm shift in armoured warfare, one that German forces were structurally incapable of countering given current resource constraints. The report was read by staff officers who filed it under Tactical Intelligence Low Priority. By December 27th, the Ardennes offensive had already failed. Fuel shortages had immobilized entire Panzer divisions. Allied air power had returned with clear weather, turning German supply columns into burning wreckage. The window for strategic surprise had closed, and with it, any possibility that detailed technical analysis might change operational outcomes. Hauptmann Ernst Vogel survived the war. He was captured by American forces on March 23, 1945, outside Remagen, commanding a makeshift battle group built from stragglers and remnants. He spent 2 years in a POW camp in Louisiana, where he worked as a mechanic maintaining American military vehicles. The irony was not lost on him. Müller survived as well, losing an arm to shrapnel in February 1945, but living long enough to return to Berlin, to marry, to build a life in a country that had to confront what its armies had done in its name. The young loader, whose name Vogel never learned, died in January 1945, killed by American artillery outside Hufvudstaden. He was 19 years old. In American archives, the engagement near Malmedy on December 18, 1944, was recorded as a minor tactical success, 3 German Panthers destroyed for the loss of 1 M10 to mechanical failure. The crews involved received no decorations, no special recognition. They had done their jobs efficiently, professionally, exactly as trained. The M10 tank destroyer would serve through the end of the war in Europe, eventually being replaced by heavier, more capable designs. But for 6 months, in late 1944 and early 1945, it was the premier German armor hunter, not because it was particularly well-armed or well-protected, but because American designers had understood that in modern warfare, the ability to choose when and where to fight was more valuable than any amount of armor plate. Speed had become a weapon, mobility had become armor, and the hunters who understood that had written the final chapters of German armoured supremacy in Belgian mud and French snow. The Panthers they destroyed were masterpieces of engineering, sophisticated, powerful, magnificent in their deadly elegance. But magnificence doesn't win wars. Effectiveness wins wars, and the crude, fast, 30-ton improvised weapons with their diesel engines and open-topped turrets proved more effective than anyone had imagined possible. Sometimes the most important lessons are learned too late to matter, and sometimes understanding why you lost is the most painful knowledge of all. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.